Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Coffee with Pastor. Um, Please let me know who's there if you would. I'd love for you to just say hello in the chat function. It's always nice to know who you're talking to. I thought I'd start off by sharing with you one of my favorite coffee mugs. I don't know if you can see that, but it's a tree and it says Hugger on it. Back when I was in seminary, I was very focused on environmental issues, and a colleague of mine, Reverend Jessica Gregory, she ended up giving that mug to me. So if for some reason Jessica was ever to watch this, there you go. Thanks again, Jessica, for this awesome coffee mug. Today, I want to talk with you about the idea of sharing your story and the message that I just gave. I talked about the responsibility of the responsibility of sharing your story. And yes, Wendell, perhaps I can share my story of running out of gas on 465 here too today. I'll do that after we get through some of the other content. But here's a couple opening thoughts. If you open up the book of Acts, Jesus says to the disciples, this is his commissioning statement to them: you will be my witnesses in all of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. The way the Christian movement spreads is by followers of Jesus sharing their story about how their faith has changed their lives. And so I think that is incredibly important. I'll say this. The idea of sharing my faith has always been something that actually I was a little bit uncomfortable with, because of the idea of being evangelical in the sense of like being a proselytizing, trying to force my faith onto other people. I went to Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, which is a Methodist seminary on the north side of Chicago. And that was during the early 2000s when the evangelical vote had put George W. Bush into office. And there was just a lot of things that were associated with that form of Christianity I wanted nothing to do with. And unfortunately, it led me to undervalue the importance of being able to share my faith. And so today's message for me, I've kind of come a long way to talk about that. So let's talk about sharing one's faith, because it is incredibly important. It's part of being a Christian. In fact, as I think about what does it look like to grow spiritually and to become mature as a follower, one thing that's going to happen to you is that you're going to become more and more outward directed. You're going to be less concerned about yourself, because you're going to believe the gospel at a deeper level, that your salvation is not dependent on you. It's dependent on who God is and God's choice to forgive you. And that changes you if you actually can embrace it. All of us secretly think that we have to earn our way in. And that's not the gospel. The gospel is that we get in because of who God is, not because of who we are. And so as we become more outward directed, we start to think about, care about, and pray for our neighbors more. People we know, people we work with, family members. And it doesn't become a thing that, how to say this? We're not trying to get something from people. We're trying to give them something. And so I loved it in Acts 26, the text that I used today for my sermon. The Apostle Paul talks about his commissioning from Jesus, and Jesus commissions him to go and preach to the Gentiles and to people, and so that they can receive forgiveness and be part of the family. He's trying to give them something. And then later, when Festus, the Roman governor, says that Paul's insane, that's hilarious to me if you read it, calls Paul insane, and then King Agrippa is like, you're trying to convert me in such a short amount of time. And Paul's like, look, I want you to become like me. And what Paul means by that is a changed man. And he says, I want you to become like me despite these chains, because Paul is in prison. But just think about that for a moment. Here Paul is in prison. He's arrested basically on a conspiracy. At that point in time, I didn't include this detail, but it's in the text. He's in the city of Caesarea, which is to the north of Jerusalem. And the reason he's there is that the Roman governor, Felix, the one prior to Festus, he realized that if he kept Paul in Jerusalem, that the conspiracy to kill Paul would probably go through. And so he transports him out of the city to keep Paul safe. They're trying to kill Paul. And here Paul is telling them about the gospel and what a wonderful thing it is. And he's like, I want you to be like me, except for these chains. And what he means by that is that Paul, even though he's enslaved, he is truly free. He's learned the secret of being content in every circumstance. He's had his heart changed. He used to be a man full of fear and anger, and now he's a person full of grace and peace. And he wants to give that to others because he can see their suffering. And it's not trying to get anything from anybody. It's trying to give them something. And I think as our faith grows and we begin to embrace the gift of God's grace, it's this gift and we just want to share it. It's a natural outgrowth. And so the process of sharing one's faith is a necessary part of the process of growing as a disciple of Jesus Christ. I don't think you can be fully mature unless you're fully ready to share your story, your faith. So how do we share our faith? And what's the benefit of it? I wrote down a few thoughts about that. Let's talk about just a couple thoughts about the power of learning to tell your own story, because that's what I'm encouraging everybody to do. So there's a positive correlation between telling your story and being formed by your story. And what I mean by this is it's easy to forget what God has done in your life. It's easy to forget what somebody else has done in your life. And so by telling that story, it begins to become more and more and more a part of you. There's a story that I tell when I'm talking about parenting. There's a moment in my teenage years that I was drinking, partying, and just on a pretty destructive path in some ways. I mean, I think I was still a pretty good kid, but I sat down with my dad and we were out to breakfast, and I was a little hungover at breakfast after church. Yep. And Dad asked me if I'd been out drinking, which I wasn't supposed to be doing. I was a teenager. And I said, yes. I had a hard time lying to Dad. And he just looked at me and he said, you know what? I'm done punishing you. You know, obviously it doesn't work. It's not the relationship I want with you. You're going to do what you want to do, but let me tell you who I think you are. And he spoke into my life a vision of who I could be, who he had thought I was. And then he said, you know, or you could ruin it. And that was kind of it. And for the years after that, when I was making, you know, bad decisions or about to make a bad decisions, Dad's voice would continue to surface. And so I've told that story over and over again. And that idea of speaking into somebody's life, a positive message, began to form me. And so these pivotal moments in our lives, they begin to become part of who we are, but we need to collect those stories. We need to form them together. And we'll talk about a few principles for doing that in a moment. And then we need to share them. And so your story about God's interaction in your life is important for you to collect and to tell. Telling your story often reveals more insights about the story. And so this was, I shared this a bit in my message, but as I thought about sharing the story about being 14 and having this neck injury and praying to God for strength and then committing to serve, because I just saw the teenagers come back from ASP, from my church, the Appalachian Service Project, and serve. As I really started to think about what that moment did in my life, it became more and more profound. In other words, as I thought about what story would I share, it didn't seem like that big of a deal, and it seemed so long ago. But as I reflected on it, I thought, hey, first, what did I do in that moment? It was one of the first times I actually opened my heart a little bit to God and to the possibility of God in a sincere way, because I was hurting and I was kind of out of options. So I opened up my heart, and I think a lot with that. But as I look forward, I went again and again. I remember when I was a college kid, there was a teenager who I was mentoring a little bit, and I stayed in relationship with this person. And later, when I was looking at seminary or thinking about it, I forget what she said, but she spoke into my life. She didn't even know how profound it was, but it was like that little bit of encouragement I needed to actually decide to go. I ended up leading groups as a youth pastor. I got assigned to be a youth pastor. I had no idea how to be a youth pastor. One thing I knew was going on this mission trip, so I signed our church up for it, and I didn't have anybody that was willing to go. And so I spent the next 3 or 4 months hounding everybody to come on the trip, and we went, and it was profound. And that was, I think we had maybe 16 people or 20 people that went. And by the time I left my role as youth pastor at Northminster Presbyterian Church in Evanston, we were taking 90 plus people on this trip, and they're still going. And we would bring them back, the teenagers, and put a microphone in their hand and have them talk about their experience. And God used that experience of listening to these teenagers and these moms and dads and these people to build my faith even more as I witnessed what could happen through a church and through a collective effort. And it all roots back to this early moment for me. And that's my story. And I hadn't really connected all those dots. And there's more, the more I think about it. But God used that. And, it's really hard to see how profound a moment is in the moment. But when we reflect back on our past, we can see how that moment, how it influenced our future and our present. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that this exercise that I think is a responsibility of a Christian is to just think back, what is my story about God, interacting in my life? And everybody's is different. What about the question of what if I've not had a profound experience? I'm aware, I thought about addressing that in my sermon, but I've been trying to cut my sermons down in length. And it's a goal of ours to have the worship service for a while just be 30 minutes because it's virtual and it's hard to be on for more than 30 minutes. And this will be 30 minutes or less here, this Coffee with Pastor. But what if I had not had a profound experience with God? And my first thought is that for most people, I think you have. Yeah, you just don't see it as profound yet. And so that's precisely why thinking back to the moments that God showed up in your life. And perhaps you might be able to identify like kind of your conversion experience, which is what I claim my experience at age 14 was. Or maybe it's later in life, but as you begin to reflect on these are the moments that I think God showed up in a profound way. As you explore and look for that, what I think you'll find is as you dig deeper, that actually it was far more profound for you and your development than you realize. And so I put it this way, the Apostle Paul got knocked down by a blinding light and was rendered blind. This is his story of the road to Damascus. I recall having an ambiguous sort of dialogue with God about my need for his strength and my willingness to serve him through ASP. I don't recall hearing a voice or anything. Rather, it was one-sided. Regardless, it had an impact on me. And so I in no way claim to ever have heard a voice from God shining down from heaven. Instead, it's more like this, what was the phrase? Kicking against the goads. The goad is the stick that a farmer uses to poke the beast or the cattle that is driving the plow. About that in the sermon because it's referenced in Acts 26. And so for me, it's more like that prodding of the Spirit. But on my end, there's always been a very distinct, not audible, but in my spirit, words towards God. God, I need your help. I need your strength. If you are real, help me, all that sort of thing. So that's always been part of it. And then I just feel something. My decision to come back, or not to come back, I went to seminary, and I didn't have intention of becoming a parish minister, a pastor like I am now. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I was just sincerely interested to learn more. And I was serving as a youth pastor doing these mission trips. And then one day I was in worship, sitting in the back. I had a lot of responsibilities on Sundays at that point. And I just remember looking at Mike and Jessica, our pastors, and feeling this sense from God that, like, that's where I want you next. And that's another kind of example of God showing up in my life. And I remember laughing because I was so busy, just had a kid, all this other stuff going on. And I said, well, basically I'll do it if you could show me how it could happen. And a lot of changes ended up happening in my life in the next 6 months. And before I know it, I was on the path. So finding your story is something you can do. And if you don't think you have one, maybe you just need to get way more simple. And so here's a way to perhaps discover one of the moments that God has showed up in your life. And it comes from the Message translation of Matthew 5:3. Jesus says, this is the first beatitude, as Eugene Peterson translates in the Message. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and God's rule. And so when has God showed up in your life? If you're struggling to figure out when that is, one thing to do is to think about, when have you been at the end of your rope? When have you been at a where your capacity to influence your life or set the direction of your life has been greatly challenged or diminished or taken away because of the circumstances you're under? I could talk about going through my divorce as a time where I felt God powerfully, losing my father when he passed away. There's many stories like that. So what if you can't figure out when God has showed up in your life? My main thought is that God has showed up. You just can't see it, and you need to get a little more simple in terms of discovering that. But it is possible. Maybe you haven't had that sincere encounter. And I think that it's because we tend to stand in the way of those sincere encounters, our pridefulness or our sense of doubt. And so God's right there. God is, I think, showing up powerfully in your life, but you can't see it because you are unwilling to believe it. In the story of Acts 26, Paul is laying out his personal story, right? He had this conversion, and then he went and he traveled all over the Roman Empire preaching. That's the story. And Festus, who he's talking to, and King Agrippa, they would have been somewhat aware, for sure, about this. They would have known about the Christian movement spreading because it was hot news, and they would have known that this guy Paul was part of that. That's why Agrippa comes to see him. I mean, he's interested. Paul's famous by this point, it seems. And so he's telling them about what happened. I went from here and here and here, and Festus calls him insane, and Agrippa says, "You're trying to convert me so quickly." And I think those are two examples of their hearts being closed. And right there, right in front of them, is Paul, right? Like God's guy. And they can't hear it because they are so convinced that they know what is right. And unfortunately, it takes, again, a moment when we're at the end of our rope, when we open our hearts to God. So maybe if you're struggling to find it, you need to just start praying, God, help me to open my heart to you. Help me to become a little simpler, a little less prideful, a little more willing to entertain belief. Okay, I'm not saying that you lose your doubts. Doubts are part of, I think, belief. But can I entertain that, perhaps you really are who Jesus says you are? Okay, real quick, a couple thoughts about how to tell your story. And I did this in the Message. You need to say when it was and where it was and what happened. Those three things. Because a good story takes place in a specific place. And so you might not know the exact location, but as close as you can get is good, because Paul's like, it was on the road to Damascus. I was on one of these journeys. He doesn't tell what the date is, but he said at about noon. And so a few relevant details helps flesh out the story. If you watch the sermon, the part where I about Colin Kinder, Officer Colin Kinder, talking about what it means to be a good witness at a traffic accident, a few relevant facts about the accident made all the difference. And one person that was willing to stay and communicate those facts, that could be the difference maker in terms of determining what happened, the accident. And so I think for us, being able to say on this date and this place, because it roots it in real time. And that's part of the piece that is so valuable, because you're claiming that God showed up in your life. And you're claiming that it made a change. And so if you can do even what Paul said, which was, I was living this kind of life, and then on this date, at this place, this happened, and then I went on this other trajectory, that is powerful. And, it might seem like just a mundane moment, but for you, it was the moment, and just being sincere about that. And I tell you, if you think about that and you spend some time going, wow, God, it seems that you really worked in that moment in my life, and you honor that. I mean, at least my personal experience is that like all this other stuff started to flow in about how that moment led to this moment and to that moment. And it was encouraging. So, we are in the small group campaign. If you haven't signed up for it, I hope you will. You can email me directly at pastor@myfaithucc.org. Get on our website, email Ryan, he'll connect you. Love to participate. It's going to start not this coming week, but this next Sunday, and then Monday and Wednesday, we're going to have groups. And we're going to engage with some material from Andy Stanley, a favorite of mine, on 5 things that God uses to grow your faith. And I think these conversations will help you begin to see how God has worked in your life. I'm super excited for our church to have those conversations. All right. So Wendell, yes, I ran out of gas on I-465. So Friday morning, I had agreed to go pick up the food from Gleaners. I borrow my brother-in-law, Ryan Feeney's box truck. He is a professional sculptor and a firefighter. And so for his sculpting business, he owns a box truck. That's how we've been getting food for, since the pandemic started, because U-Haul closed down at the beginning of that. So I borrowed his box truck. I was running a little bit late. I was supposed to be at Gleaners at 6:50 in the morning. It is possible to have a couple of food counters. If so, okay. Let me pause the. I'll finish telling my story here real quick, Nathan, about running out of gas, and then I'm going to answer your questions before the 30-minute mark. I'm driving down 465. The truck lurches. I'm in the left-hand lane. I push down on the gas. There is no gas. I realize I'm out of gas. When I look at the gas gauge, and it's on E. I didn't even look at it before I left. Never make that mistake again. I had to get across like 3 or 4 lanes of traffic right where I-70 pulls off of 465. And I was coasting. I had no gas, no ability to accelerate. And by the grace of God, I got all the way over. I called a few people, but it was super early in the morning. Nobody was picking up. Picking up the food from Gleaners was time sensitive, so I was worried about that. And I got on my phone. I found that there was a gas station a mile and a half away. I ended up having to jump a ravine, climb a fence, walk the mile and a half. Took me 20, 25 minutes. Get a gas can, fill it up, bring it back. And it turns out that the gas tank for the truck was on the exposed side. And there was cars just whizzing by. And honestly, I was frightened to put the gas in. And then I just had troubles getting gas in because of like the little safety valve on the thing. And it wasn't long enough to get in there, but enough was getting in, and gas is flying everywhere, and I'm getting gasoline all over my hands. I get it started. I have just enough gas to get to a gas station and fill it up. And I got to Gleaners, and they were almost closed, and they got us the food anyways. And I told them what happened, and they had grace on me. But it was wild, and we brought the food, and by 8:30, I'd already had a heck of a day. So yeah, that was the story. I talked to Father Ryan on the phone about it while I was walking back, and I said to him that this might be the last conversation we ever have, because I was about to go stick my neck out with traffic going by to try to fill up this truck. I was somewhat joking, but very serious. So I'm just grateful that that worked out. Several people have counseled me afterwards. I should have called the police and had them there to like kind of protect me. Probably a wise thing. So Nathan, your question, is it possible to have a couple of specific encounters? And if so, do I share them all at once? I would say yes, and then no. Yes, of course, you can have several specific encounters. And in fact, I think to develop those stories, and by develop them, I mean, figure out what are the relevant facts and kind of how am I going to tell that story. It doesn't have to be overly engineered, but you spend a little bit of time on it. And the more of those stories you have about authentic encounters with God, the more equipped you are to meet people where they are. So, for example, I've shared my story about knowing that my dad had passed before we knew, on the day that he had a heart attack. And before I got in the car with my mom and sister to go down to Methodist Hospital, I was driving to my mom's house to meet them, and we were just going to all get in the same car. And I just had this overwhelming sense of like peace that, that dad was gone. Weirdly, I had peace. And then I just said, thank you, started thanking God for my father. And it was a profound experience, tears coming down my eyes. And then 25 minutes later, I was in the car and mom was on the phone with the doctor, and they were saying that dad was coding again. His heart was stopping again. The phone got handed to me, and I made the call to stop interventions with my father. And some people have had to do that. And they know what that feels like. And so I'm able to kind of share, how God showed up for me in that moment. So I think you develop those stories, and then I say, don't share them all at once. For the pure fact of like, I think that after you share your story, I think that you want to create space for the other person to respond, to ponder it. You might kind of switch to, have you ever had anything profound? And not interrogate, but maybe gently question or invite the other person to reflect on the profound moments in their lives. And then, if the situation calls for it, you could share another one. Yeah. But, just trying to be careful about, it'd be easy to overwhelm people. And I think the thing that sometimes makes non-believers have a hard time believing the witness of a believer is that we say too much, and we make it sound too good and too hard to believe. And we need to slow down the pace sometimes and understand that, we got to meet people where they are. I'll just share this little kind of concluding thought. I started reading another book, or a new book. It's called, what is it called? Becoming Human, I think. And it's by this guy, Carl Rogers. And he was an innovator in the field of psychology back in the 50s and throughout his career. And he understood something profound, which is as the therapist, somebody could give the right diagnosis and even the right application of what to do. But if the person who needs to do it isn't convinced or motivated, it doesn't much matter. And so Rogers was really big on taking his time and not outpacing the client and helping the client arrive at their own conclusion. And I think that, I would want to take a page out of his book if I was sharing about my faith and say, look, when the opportunity presents itself for me to share how God has showed up in my life, I want to tell a very thoughtful, concise story that is true and authentic, and that will hopefully inspire the person or motivate the person to be curious and maybe ask some more. But I want to try not to get in front of them or say too much in that scenario. That would definitely be my problem. I mean, like, cool, I can convince you. Like, let me tell you all these sorts of things. And, what is the saying? People don't care what you know until they know that you care. And so you need to really spend time making sure that you're caring for them. And that's giving them space, letting them kind of work through, and just knowing that like a little bit of your story, a little bit of God can go a long way. Thank you, everyone, for being here with me. It's profound to me that you would spend time for this Coffee for Pastor. And I am so grateful. I hope all of you are going to be part of the small groups. I'm glad you're looking forward to it, Nathan. And Wendell, thanks. I'm glad I'm alive as well. I'm glad you're alive too. So let me offer a benediction. May the grace and peace and love of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you on the rest of this day, throughout the rest of your week, the rest of your lives. Amen.